Welcome, everyone, to the guest speaker program of the U.S. Asia Law Institute at the NYU School of Law. I'm the Institute's Executive Director, Catherine Wilhelm, and today our topic is China's activities and goals in the Arctic region. And of course, the reason that we are looking to the far north is the recent statements by the Trump White House that if the United States does not control Greenland, China and Russia will. So in this program, we are going to use Greenland as a jumping off point for looking more broadly at what China is doing across the Arctic region, not just Greenland, and also asking whether China's activities in the region comply with international law and practices. So our guide this morning is Yuanyuan Ren, who is an assistant professor at the University of Dayton Law School. She's also a former postdoc Hauser Global Fellow here at NYU Law, so we're especially thrilled to have her with us today. She has been researching and writing about the Arctic for years from the perspective of international law, including in particular the law of the sea, or UNCLOS. And early in her career, she spent a year at the Polar Research Institute of China. She's also a fellow with the University of the Arctic, which is a virtual network of schools and institutions that research the Arctic from many different disciplinary perspectives. So our program will begin with Yuanyuan making some opening remarks, and then I'm going to ask a few questions to get us going. And I hope that some of you in the audience will also raise questions. For that, please use the Q&A button in your Zoom toolbar. So with that, Yuanyuan, the floor is yours. Please get us going. And I think you have slides as well, so you may share those.
Sure. Thank you so much, Catherine, for inviting me to talk about China's role in the Arctic today. So I'm very much looking forward to our conversations today. I recognize that probably some of our audience today might not that very familiar with the recent developments in the Arctic. So please allow me to share begin with a few slides, hopefully to provide some broader context of this discussion. And I hope you all find this introduction section informative and useful. Yeah, so let us start with the Arctic. I think the first question is, what is the Arctic? But for sure, first of all, there is no penguin in the Arctic. It's a home for the polar bears. So actually for the Arctic, we have several definitions, especially under the different international law treaties. But in general, there is a very basic definition for the Arctic. From this map, you can show that generally we understand the Arctic as a region that located in the northern end of this planet. It includes both the land and the sea, oceans, within this so-called Arctic Circle. So from this circle here, you can see that at least 8 countries, namely Canada, Denmark, by the virtue of the Greenland, Iceland, Norway, Sweden, Finland, Russia, and of course the United States. That's what we usually talk about Arctic states. So we also call them A8. So those have the coastal and the land within this circle. And what's happening in the Arctic? So the Arctic sea ice is melting. So for a long time, we were thinking about that the Arctic warming. It's right now, according to the latest research, it shows the Arctic actually is warmed at 4 times faster than the rest of the planet. So you can imagine that this melting decline of the sea ice can pose both the opportunities and the threats, right? But as well as the challenges. So that is the overall picture about what is going on about the Arctic, this region, and who are there. So again, our United States, it's an Arctic state. But unlike the governance of the Antarctica, right? And there is no Arctic treaty in this area. So in terms of Arctic governance, that I would say there are three key features of this governance. We also talk about the role of international law in this system or regime. So first of all, we see there's multi-levels governance system. We have a polar law community in our studies field, and we don't think that polar law only include international law. Let us take the Alaska as example, right? We have domestic regulations, we have indigenous people governance, and we have regional and international levels, treaties, and governance as well. And because we don't have an overall comprehensive Arctic treaty, so right now, the Arctic issues, it might be the indigenous people's right, climate change, environmental protections, investments, trade, and all those issues actually were or are governed by this issue-specific arrangement. For example, the most recent international treaty was signed and came into force is the so-called the Central Arctic Ocean High Sea Fishery Agreement. It was negotiated and was adopted for the purpose to prevent commercial fishing in this central high sea portion of the Arctic Ocean. You can see that for these two main actors or participants, here is not only Arctic states, but also China, Japan, Korea, EU, those so-called non-Arctic entities. Many of the issues regarding the Arctic affairs are governed or managed by these so-called soft law corporations. And a key forum for the Arctic issue is the so-called Arctic Council. Here, I just want to highlight the Arctic Council was established for the, generally speaking, the environmental protection in the Arctic region. So one thing, the security issue is not addressed in this council. So overall, we can see the United States here, right? So United States is an Arctic country, but China is not. However, still, in 2018, that the Chinese published a white paper about China's Arctic policy. It defined China as a near Arctic state. That really draws a lot of attention to China's increasing activities in the Arctic. So far, the social medias, the literature scholars have nicely described China's activities and interest in the Arctic in general. So here just the highlights. Basically, there are three categories. I also agree with that. The first one is for sure is science research. China has sent 16, if I'm right, so far, the Arctic expeditions to the Arctic oceans and regions. And of course, Arctic is rich in many resources and economic opportunities. And lastly, China is really very active in the political participation in those Arctic forums, right, including the Arctic Council. So far, this is what I grabbed from the social medias, trying to show that the road or timeline for China, the goal to be a polar power, especially those are the projects in the Arctic. I was very privileged to I deeply engaged and participated this China and Iceland Aurora observation station in Iceland. So that is what China's increasing, especially the scientific and the political participation in the region. So there are two voices. One voice is China offered or presented as an opportunity, or China at this region is as a threat. So there is a basic voice and debates, and also draws a lot of controversies. So I want to a little bit zoom in, and of course, a cornerstone of China's Arctic activities or the plan or policy is so-called here you can see the so-called Polar Silk Road. It's for sure it's an extension of the China's famous Belt and Road Initiative. So, for example, the last summer to the fall, and China just sent a Chinese container. It's not an LNG ship, just to cross the whole ocean here. The time is less than 20 days, and it's roughly 40% faster than the China's cargoes and ships go to the traditional sea routes down over there. And I also want to talk very briefly about China and Greenland. I didn't talk about China in Greenland in this title because soon we might discuss further with Catherine, is China's many projects in Greenland actually didn't go well. But China is right now currently dominant of the market, the mining of the rare earth elements. But Greenland is rich in that resources as well. This is just a very quick example to show how the Greenland is so significant and strategic important for those powers. So overall, that's when we talk about China's role and activities, why China's increasing activities draws so much attention. We talk about these great power competitions in this region. We have Russia, 20% of Russia's territory is within this Arctic Circle, right? And Trump is entering this second administration. So we are thinking about this China's role and the activities in the Arctic under the broader speculation of this great war or great power competition. So I think I will stop here. One of the key questions for my research, including my dissertation, was about, I really wondered whether China really can play a normative role in the Arctic governance and development, and through what kind of approach that China approach international law or use international law as its engagement with the Arctic. So I hope this introduction helps you to understand the overall picture of the Arctic and China's activity in the Arctic. So I look forward to the questions and our conversations. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Yuanyuan. I enjoy those maps because we sometimes forget how much of the globe is up there and what is
Yes.
going. It's outside of our usual of what we're usually looking at when we see the globe. It's usually, more centered. We don't go up from that perspective. So you've painted a pretty comprehensive picture of what the Arctic is and China's interests in transiting it. The first issue maybe for us to just jump on is Greenland, because that's the trigger for the program. You said that Greenland is rich in rare earths, and of course we know that China is a major player in the rare earths mining and processing and sales and so on market. Why hasn't China succeeded in entering mining in Greenland? It's tried, right?
I think that's a great question. So China is interested in the opportunities in the Greenland as well. But let us start to talk about, if we think about the legal status of Greenland, and it's still part of the Denmark, but it's a self-governance, right? The self-governed territory. And I was privileged this last summer, the past year, went to Greenland for the Polar Law Symposium. It was my first field trip there. So what I'm saying is that it's not free of that, for a market or the United States or China to buy or to conquer. It still have a sovereignty issue there. And also another important factor or element that I want to highlight is who governs this or controls this piece of land. Is the indigenous people, is the Greenland people there. Right?
Hmm.
So for those issues, if we take this as a background, I guess it's no matter this is a great power from the China's engagement or our great President Donald Trump's deal won't be welcomed by both the government of Denmark, I guess also the local governance. I guess that also tells some reasons why China actually was probably had been still interested in the Greenland for the the airport, for the mining projects, but didn't resale well, both from the local government and Denmark, Greenland.
Was it blocked from making investments? In other
Yes,
words, did the
yes.
local authorities?
Parliament, yes, yes. But I may not know the whole overall picture. That's why I always feel like for the Greenland issues that we need a lot of field work. We don't know people there. And I might stretch a little bit. For example, like when I met students who are actually from the Greenland and are studied the polar law at the University of Akureyri, and she actually a prosecutor, but there's no law school in Greenland, and all of her education need to go to the Denmark, right, the mainland. So that's very interesting. We don't know, but they are at the same with like Alaska indigenous people. They are facing all this economic crisis, the opportunities as well, but also the climate change. Yeah.
What did you find out whether the concern on the part of Greenland is for security, or was it an economic reason that prevented China from investing in rare earths mining and development in Greenland? Was it economic issues, or was it security issues that has kept China from developing its making investments there?
I would say both. First of all, at least in my opinion, I don't separate the economic security like that. There's no clean line for me if I look at the security as a very broad concept. So they are combined, like it's mixed. But we all know that's just in general speaking that, as I showed, because the sea ice is melting, because we have all those big power there, and Arctic itself is becoming a security hotspot. So it's security concern, because in my slides I only showed that the mining, the natural resources there. But if you look into the whole map, that Greenland is definitely located a very strategic point there, because if the sea ice melting, we also talk about the two sea routes. The opening ones, that one is along the Russian side, another side along the Canadian coastal areas. And Greenland is there. It's in that right place, right? So it's not only economic speaking that Greenland is full of opportunities for all of these kind of resources, but also if that the sea melting ice melting continues. It's not necessarily always every year decline. Actually, there are some years quite harsh during the summer as well. But you see that the strategic location there also play a role. First, think about that all the goods, especially between the European market and the Chinese or Asian market. That's the points there. And of course, for our governments, we also consider, because in overall, that Greenland is located more close to the Canadian and our American side.
Right.
That is very strategic important that claim, or we really concerned as a country about the security role of Greenland.
Yes, I've seen Greenland described as the gateway to the Arctic, right? Which is, I think, what you're saying. So if China sends commercial vessels through the Arctic waters, it could go north up the coast of China and Russia through the Arctic and come out into the North Atlantic down by where Greenland is. So the location, of course, we can see very clearly the reasons why this would be an important place for the U.S. or other countries that are concerned about Atlantic security to monitor. But then the statement from President Trump and his administration has been that Chinese ships are all over the place there, that Chinese destroyers are there, as well as Russian submarines. So are Chinese warships in the North Atlantic around Greenland? Are Chinese research vessels operating in that area of the Arctic, or are Chinese fishing vessels operating in that area of the North Atlantic, to your knowledge?
So that's actually a very good point and reminder for me. I guess one thing I didn't mention so far when we talk about Greenland and the United-China relations or the different perspectives regarding the Greenland is Greenland actually has several. It's not only important for the economic opportunities, not only for those political or the military securities, and it's also important for science, for the research, for environmental protections. So there are already stations, research stations there, and we, United States, have the military base there. But I guess one of the concern with China's activities in general speaking, not only in Greenland, but generally in the Arctic, including the projects that I did, I participated in the Iceland, is this so-called dual use, those facilities. So yeah, so you can claim and even calling the enclosed, you can send the research team or the vessels, especially along different jurisdictions or marine areas. But whether this is research, right, especially from the Western commentators or scholars' points or from the government, it's weak. It can be used, including the Greenland, if we are seeing, particularly speaking. Yes, China sent those research stations and stuff there, as well as we can, and along these expeditions and the scientific voyage. But whether those data collections, whether what's the main or real purpose, that might raise doubts about that, right? So that also raised the security concerns for those Arctic states, including the United States.
So just, I want to make sure I'm understanding you. You're saying that China does send research staff to conduct research in Greenland?
Yes, we have a station there.
You have a station. Is it a permanent station?
I believe so. I feel like I should update all of my information things right now. I'm working on the domestic stuff, but yes. So that is not only China. And again, that's, I guess, when we think about, we can continue some topics, but when we think about China's presence in the Arctic, it's really under a broader speculation of the rising China globally. It's also in Africa and other regions. So here you have these Arctic states over here have the sovereignty there.
Right. Yeah, so there is always the question when it comes to China's activities, whether it's the Arctic or anywhere, a question rises of whether the concern from Washington or from any other capitals is because of the nature of what China is doing, or is the concern simply because it's China that's doing it, right? And so what would you say it's one or the other in the case of the Arctic, including Greenland, but not exclusively? Is it what China's doing that raises concerns, or is it the fact that it's China that's doing anything that raises the concerns, or is it some combination of both of them?
Safely probably say both, right? But I guess I would say whatever China do there, and it will draw a lot of attention, right? And that's what we see in this new era of the great power competition, especially between the United States and China. And also very interesting that we have Russia there. Russia is the big power in the Arctic Ocean. And we might also have the chance to talk about the implication of the Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And when this separated Russia as a member of 8 Arctic states, separated from the others, Arctic 7, and it's kind of putting the Moscow towards to China as well, right? So this is also increased, in my opinion, the speculation about why China is here, because Russia also offers the opportunities for China access to come to this area. But I would say yes, whatever that China is doing there, as you said, that is kind of really concerned because China's current status, right? and especially with the high advanced technology and all of this budget military development.
Hmm. Yeah, Russia is, I believe, the country that controls the largest landmass of the Arctic and also the largest coastline on the Arctic Sea. Is that right?
Yes.
And then also has the most bases, the most military installations in the Arctic is Russia as well, right?
Yes.
Has China, we know China has conducted military exercises with Russia in various other places. Have they conducted any kind of joint military activity in the Russian Arctic or with Russia at its military installations in the Russian Arctic?
I believe the answer should be yes, but
Mm,
I should admit that I didn't follow up very closely with recent 2 years. There's a
mm,
military operation there, but I just quickly check about news. I believe that yes. Um,
mm,
so regarding the Russia and the United States, regarding the Russia and China's relationship in the Arctic, if that's how I understand or perceive this question, it's like, yes, there are definitely implications of Russia's invasion of the Ukraine. And
mhm,
after that, for example, immediately, we might also talk about the Arctic Council, that immediately there's so many engagement and connections with the Russia immediately stopped, paused for a while. And China and Russia, I guess, in terms of China's investment in the Arctic, maybe China's biggest Arctic investment happened or located in Russia side. The Yamar, the LNG's projects, its value $27 billion. There is the biggest projects there. And I believe just the last week, I think Putin signed the protocol for this agreement, how to proceed with these projects. Yeah, this is on news last week. But overall, that people, some social media, it's saying that it's like honey, like a very all aspects cooperations relationship between the Moscow and Beijing. But actually, I want to personally, I feel like there also might be some challenges and limitations for those China and Russia collaboration or cooperation in the Arctic. I don't know how many of our audience knows there once, like 2018, there was a Russian scientist who was arrested by the Russian government for charging the treason to disclose some Russians, the data to the Chinese government, and he passed away in 22. Excuse me. He was staying home for all the time, left time. So it's not always this honey rosy stories regarding the China and Russia's relationship and the cooperation in the Arctic. And I personally think, like in long run, that one thing that highlight in the China's Arctic policy is China is saying yes, there are 8 countries have the territory, can claim different sovereignty rights based on the UNCLOS or the UN Convention of the Law of Sea, but there's still the global common, that high sea in the middle or somewhere, right? Which actually offers the seas or that the other countries, even the non-Arctic country, had the right to participate for the decision makings. But this is in the long run, personally, I think, contradict with Russians' view about the Arctic. Because as you also mentioned, Russia has the largest land and the coastal like portion and definitely a power there. And Russia is more prefer to this exclusive club. So this doesn't go well, in my opinion, at some points that when more, see open-minded for the other participants, but as a sovereign countries, especially Russia, they might not like this idea. I will keep this conversation a little bit short for these Russia issues. I will give back the floor to you.
Okay. No, but this is quite interesting because it tees up some questions about governance. So just to sort of, I want to summarize what I think I hear you saying, although on the overall question of to what extent do China's activities in the Arctic give rise to strategic concerns or security concerns? You're saying there is some basis for concern if the US or the West is in rivalry with China because China is there. They have research on Greenland. They have tried, although failed, to invest in the rare earths market in Greenland. And Greenland is strategically located in a place that makes it very important. So that's all correct. And China is close to Russia, which controls a good part of the Arctic region. So all of these could be facts that somebody could use to make an argument for China as some kind of an Arctic threat. But then if we focus on what China is actually doing, is there anything that China has done to date that one could point to and say, well, that actually challenges international law or practice? Is there anything that would would raise concerns in that way?
I think that's a great question. So based on my research, not because I range land from the mainland China, I would say that, but according to my research and many people's research shows that actually there's really strong evidence or a strong indication that China has been a so-called rule follower in the Arctic region. The reason is actually simple for me, straightforward, because as whatever the Chinese government in the 2018 paper described is near Arctic states or not, the reality or the fact is China does not have any territory in the Arctic. It's a non-Arctic state. And sometimes some people like to link the Arctic and the South China Sea, especially when we consider the Russian and the Canadian sovereignty claims in the Arctic Ocean. But, China, we Chinese had the idiom saying that whatever you don't, other people do unto you, that you would not do the same thing to other people. So China has really respect, and the state sovereignty is a keystone for the Chinese international law approach, right? And we all know China. We all know that China really care about the state sovereignty. Therefore, based on this, the bottom line, there's no really strong evidence to show that China really challenged, particularly regarding those sovereignty, like the governance or the treaties, applications, or implement in the Arctic. On the contrast, actually, on the other hand, China is trying to contribute. For example, that the Central Arctic Ocean, the high sea fisheries. And China is organizing the working shops, the working groups, especially in terms of science. However, I want to say one thing is, but there are some issues I also personally concerned is, for example, I just showed you that the last year China's a container ship just trespassed the Northern Sea route and goes all the way along this beautiful, fragile oceans, but we also know that IMO, that we have a polar code for those vessels who traveled across the ice, especially the polar waters, that need to follow the treaties regarding what kind of classes, right, of the vessels and the environmental pollution. But so far as I know, there's kind of secret that both the Russian government and Chinese government, there's no data shows how this voyage satisfied, for example, the implement of the polar code. So that might raise concern, like in terms of the environmental footprint and the other detailed issues, whether how nicely China's compliance with the law, that's the issue. Yes, that's.
So I'm sorry, I want to make sure, sorry to interrupt, I want to make sure I understand what you're saying. You're saying that China's sending the container ship through the Northern Sea route was not sufficiently transparent?
Yes, in general, I would argue that because, like, when we talk about the Northern Sea routes, it's under the Russians' control. It's controversial. It has been, controversial for decades. Like United States also sent diplomat letters regarding that. We think that's the international street, but for Canadian side as well, they believe those are the internal waters. So overall, in practice, that even you pass the Russian coastal that area, especially during the summer, they companion you with their icebreaker, and there's pilots, right? You need the permission to go all this way. So generally speaking, that both the ship owner, right, when you pass it, well, right now that's the ownership is the Chinese government or it's a Chinese ship, or the Russian authority, they definitely have data regarding this whole voyage. I would say it's less transparent, yes.
Okay, okay. So that could be a concern from an environmental perspective.
Exactly.
You mentioned the South China Sea. So I just wanted to tie that together. I guess the relevance of the South China Sea to the Arctic would be that it's it's well known that China has challenged the application of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea in the South China Sea. Its interpretation has been in tension with other states' interpretations, and it has rejected the findings of an international tribunal in a claim from the Philippines, where China claims sovereignty over much of the South China Sea, and the International Tribunal ruled against China's claim and said, no, the Philippines has title to some of this, has a better claim to some of this. China rejected that. So the result is that there's a lot of concern about the extent to which China really adheres to the generally accepted understandings of the law of the sea. And if it doesn't accept it in the South China Sea, why would it accept it in the Arctic, I guess would be the question, right? So, but you're saying there's nothing that China has actually done in practice, or have they not said anything with respect to the Arctic that would make us think that they want to disregard the law of the sea or push the boundaries in the Arctic region?
That's a complicated question. That's why I developed the whole paper, a law review paper
Okay.
last year about this implication of the South China Sea's arbitration for the Arctic governance. But overall, that's actually this year is 2026, is the 10 years anniversary for this vote from the Philippines, that arbitration. But that's actually the arbitration also shows the limitation of UNCLOS, if I may argue, that we all know, especially for those first-liner diplomats, so who actually goes international negotiation, we know sometimes that we cannot reach a perfect agreement or a memo there. Instead, it's more like the bottom line there. We know there's loopholes. We know there's so many ambiguities in the UNCLOS provisions clause itself. That's why different countries or different states might have totally different visions regarding the South China Sea or the Arctic, especially regarding this sea passage there. But overall, that because China is a sovereignty, if I may argue that somehow China is sovereignty state in the South China Sea area, therefore he knows these issues, whatever the historic titles and the fishery rights can be controversy. So when China engaged in the Arctic, especially along the sides of the Canadians, archipelagos, and also the Russian side, China has not so far have a cleaning standing, like the opinion, like what's your sovereign limit there. It's therefore China is not directly joined the United States claim the freedom of navigation because it's backyard has issue there. But in my article, actually, I paid more attention about it's very technical issue about the historic titles and waters, because in Arctic, both the Russia, especially Canadian government, claim those water, the large portion over the whole Canadians Arctic archipelago. Why it's Canadians? Because the historic rights, because Inuit people's occupation and use for the years. But one thing that clearly laid in the Arctic, in the South China Sea arbitration is this I call high sea approach to those issues. So overall, I see that the Arctic states, all of it, actually so far not really have a strong opinion about Arctic South China Sea arbitration. because many
Mm,
of them, they also have their sovereignty concern as well. So I discussed more in my paper there. So
sure.
hopefully have more opportunities or a chance to talk about that issue. But I will stop here for the other questions.
Right. 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 Well, it sounds like China's arguments from the South China Sea would be quite different from its interests and arguments in the Arctic. It would be coming at it from the opposite. So in the Arctic, it might be more inclined to adopt the arguments of the Philippines than, yeah,
Exactly, exactly.
it's on the other side of the shoe is on the other side. So let me turn to some of the questions from our audience. And one points out that whatever China might want to achieve in the Arctic, the fact that it is not an Arctic country, of course, could be a barrier to it. Um, so how can China claim interests there? Can it only do so through partnerships with the actual Arctic Eight? Um, and that you've touched a bit on partnerships with Russia, of course, but does China on its own steam, as a non-Arctic country, have certain rights or interests that it can pursue in the Arctic? And are they the same as the rights and interests of every other country on the globe that is not an actual Arctic nation?
Mhm. Thank you for the great questions. I think generally speaking, China is just like other countries, non-Arctic there.
Mm,
And that is the basic status. And just because this rising status of the China, because as I showed that the high seas Arctic fishing, that agreement, there are also Korean, that's Japan, we all participated in that area or these issues. So, and by the way, the beginning of this question also remind me that I guess although China has a lot of engagement so far in the Arctic from all these three perspectives, the science, economic, and political engagement, but still, I would argue that Arctic is not a priority for
mm,
China. It's like national policy or strategy overall, right? We can think about this AI, the advanced technology, its own backyard, South China Sea, and the Taiwan, Hong Kong issues. The Arctic is, I sometimes say, this is a Chinese approach, very practical. We will see how we fit there. Wherever the opportunities arise, that China's, the money, the investments, and opportunities will jump in. And also, China is really also impacted by the climate change, environmental protection, the fisheries. All these issues are global issues. And of course, as a non-Arctic, but the member of this planet, they have a right based on the UNCLOS, some others international, regime. They have a right to participate some of the Arctic issues if it's not that local or regional. But in general, it won't. I personally think it's not the China's top priority still this region.
mm. Well, what are the rights of non-Arctic states under the existing framework of governance that you set out, this multi-layer framework? What can non-Arctic states do?
That's also a great question. I guess I will start with climate change.
Mm,
That it's really the Arctic is the region has been impacted by these global issues. As I showed, that
mm,
Arctic region actually warmed 4 times faster than the rest. So
mm,
when the other coastal areas still, not suffer that much, but our Alaska's coastal areas has been really ruined by those harsh
mm,
weathers as well, right? So those global issues like the sea level rise, like climate change, environmental protection, I would always say, thanks to my short experience with the Chinese Polar Research Institute, science go first in the Arctic. That we don't know this region so far so much. That is also the whole global society can contribute, regardless you are the Arctic states or the Arctic non-Arctic states, regardless you are Arctic-based states scientist or you are not. That we need science. That the whole
mm,
decision making should be science driven. So
mm,
there are so global issues that I believe that we have UNCLOS. We have the climate change, the protocols as well. Those more global issues, global international framework, of course, offered the non-Arctic participants the voice, at least, for some Arctic decision making.
Right. So China should be able to contribute its science, but also you seem to be suggesting to advocate or lobby or push for certain approaches to controlling pollution that would cause damage in the Arctic. So, as a global citizen, China has a voice in the decisions that are made that affect the Arctic. But is there a tension, though, or how do you see the tension between the rights of the actual Arctic states, the Arctic Eight, and the rest of the globe? They will clash, I would imagine, when it comes to the Arctic Eight perhaps wanting to exploit the resources of the region for their own economic development, and the rest of the globe, possibly including China, wanting to regulate that development in the interests of the global climate. Have we already seen, are there any concrete debates that are occurring right now where we might see that kind of a tension?
Yes, I would say in general, right? Especially when we look into the work of the Arctic Council, and it's still a kind of, if I may argue, it still is exclusive club. It's still controlled by the Arctic states, although that's China and some others, Asian and other non-Arctic countries or governments were admitted be an observer at this Arctic Council, the main high-level governmental levels forum. Still, including China, you are outsider. Those conversations really happened every day, probably on the Arctic Council's, the forums and the conversations as well. And also, the Arctic's unique. I don't want to, just overlook that part. Is indigenous people, right? That is very unique. There's in Antarctic, there's penguin there. There's no indigenous people here, but the Arctic indigenous people have their rights, and actually they are important decision makers actually in the Arctic Council. So overall, I would feel like they're already clash over there, and that's why we always see the Arctic is very strategic sensitive. It's all, even we started this whole conversation. So what is Arctic? There are different definitions of Arctic. There's no political free definition of Arctic. That's why I personally find that topic and this research is very interesting for me, because it's keep evolving. But the reality is indigenous people, they suffered from those climate change, and they are facing this, and they were colonial regions as well, if you look into the history. And we do have these global issues have to deal with together as the whole planet. So this is a going on conversation, but I guess that's really a very sharp and wise observation about this clash.
Mm. How effective has the Arctic Council been as a governance body? Is it, we've become used to the idea that, for example, a lot of UN bodies are dysfunctional. Would you say the Arctic Council is better than that, or is it also?
Yep. I mean, although now I'm located in the United States, based on my research, I believe, and it's functional. It's functional. I think it's functional for several reasons, and one of the main reasons is that it clearly at the beginning says we don't address the security issue. So they are very focused on the soft law, the common issue that people need, the whole, the states have to deal with, like environmental protection, the science research. That's the key. And also, like compared to UN, for example, this is small club. It's still like the A8. Like you have some observations, the observers has been increasing over the years, but it functions well. It has there's overarching, they have there's work groups that already focus on different marine issues like environmental protections. That is work well, but of course, because it's keep opening to more non-Arctic participants. although probably not on the decision level, that's exactly the clash different challenges is came to this governance forum. But overall, it's functioned well, and I'm still pretty optimistic about this. I believe that although there's impacts of the Ukraine's issue, like the Russia's invasion to Ukraine, but still there's a lot of going on projects and scientific work still working involving the Russia.
Right. You mentioned Ukraine a few times. So basically, what is the situation? Since Russia went into Ukraine, has Russia been blocked from
Yes.
participating in the Arctic Council?
Yes, I think it's just the kind of the connection was broken for a while.
Okay.
I guess it's getting back and it's now better. But also there's other, yes, but this also, because it triggered the sanction from the EU as well, and the many Arctic Nordic countries, they are members of EUs. So these all issues are connected.
Okay. But now Russia is back to participating in the council?
I believe so, not full scale, but
Okay.
yeah. And by the way, this Ukraine's war will continue probably for a while. We still see that how much that the United States can play in this, peace process. But climate is still changing. The scientists' research is going on, so I believe that it's not a long, really way or a goal to exclude Russia, because Russia is important in the Arctic research and everything there.
Right, right. So one of the audience points out that, of course, there's two sides of the Arctic. So the Arctic Ocean comes down, and you can enter from the Pacific
European,
side. The Pacific side, you go through the Bering Strait between Alaska and Russia. And then on the other side, you have the passageway we were talking about by Greenland, but also, of course, across the top of Europe, you can enter into the Arctic. Is more of China's activity on the Pacific side that would make sense for it to be more active there? So to what extent is China interested in or active in the Atlantic side versus the Pacific side? And is there any difference in, their level of activity, but also the concerns about as a threat?
I'm thinking that it's still going back to it's based on the Arctic sea ice, or whether it's really feasible. Because as the map shows, the Arctic sea ice actually still covers a large space, especially in the non-summer seasons. And if China is more interested to using the so-called Arctic sea routes for some purposes, for the research, for the commercial use, that I guess the Russian side is still more feasible than the Canadian side. If this is a precondition, then still China's all kind of research, military, or the commercial ships will still go from the Chinese east coastal area or the port to the Berlin Strait from the Pacific, go all the way down along the Russian side and go to Antarctic. That's European side. So in terms of like which portion, but I'm thinking under those tensions right now between the United States and China, because China has increased the presence in the Arctic, I guess on this Pacific side, it's also under, the eyes of our American militaries nowadays, right? This is a scope that might create a challenge for China to pass from there. Right. And also you mentioned that there is China and Russia's military operations sometimes exercise over there. But the China's destination, I believe, should go to the European market. It's hard at this moment for me to say which portion or which this gates is more important, because it's a trespass. This is a whole passage there.
Has the Chinese government spoken about the commercial shipping route in any of its next 5-year plan? the Chinese National People's Congress should be approving a 5-year plan, I think, when it meets next month. Does it talk at all about the opening up of an Arctic passage and the so-called Polar Silk Road as important commercially, or as part of its effort now to increase exports to Europe now that the U.S. market has been reduced because of Trump's tariffs and so on? Is this discussed as a strategy, as a commercial goal?
I apologize. I haven't checked about these documents or the drafts, but my speculations, my thought maybe no. Again, that we know that Arctic, for the Chinese government, Arctic is strategic important, or if we look those polar region as a whole. But overall, I think it's unlikely to, just like our president just gave that the national speech, it's unlikely to mention Arctic, both in the Chinese Congress levels and the United States level as well. But I guess that is also consistent with China's approach in the Arctic, keep it low key. And when I was working at the Polar Research Institute, we started with, talk with those industry sectors, right? The companies who actually can go and try to put this into force. And it's, sorry for the sounds, suddenly some sounds out of my window there, but it started low key approach. It's unlikely in my opinion, that be showed up at this moment in any that's national levels strategies planned. But it's going on, and it's really carried by the state-owned companies.
One of the questions is whether other non-Arctic states like China are similarly trying to be very active in the Arctic Council or in Arctic exploration, and if so, who would they be?
So far, like the Eastern Asian countries like Japan, South Korea, we're all interested, especially when you look into the map, that's really the way the Asian market goes to the Europe or even the American market there. But we also actually, 2 years later, our Polar Law Symposium will be held in Singapore. So there are more southern states are applying for the observers of the Arctic Council, and India is there too. And as far as I know, the Turkish government is also preparing their Arctic policy. And so there's, broadly speaking, there are many countries, not necessarily geographical speaking, that located near to the Arctic, but very interested in this development in the Arctic region. Yeah, so there are many countries are also looking up to the north.
Do you think that route, if we continue with the global warming path that we're on, do you think that in, I don't know, some time period, perhaps a decade or two, it will become, in fact, a significant shipping route?
Yes, and at least according to the current research shows, some scientists or the reports were quite optimistic. I guess they are saying like 2030s, especially during the summer seasons, it can be snow-free.
Right. And just very quickly, because we're almost out of time, what would the downside, if that happens, what would the downsides be? If any? The negatives of having the Arctic Sea and these different polar routes become major shipping routes?
If all the ice melt, I believe it's not only the Arctic, but Antarctic, because it's a global climate change, right?
Okay.
So sea rise will overall over the oceans will be raised up. And also I was thinking that, yes, as I started, like it's definitely open access, but it's also bring the challenges, especially when our human footprints over there, the tourists can come in, right? And not only that, the research people's tourist commercials opportunities, and also the Arctic Sea routes is definitely really imposed environmental challenges. And of course, from the domestic perspective, I guess for Canadian government and Russian governments, the regulation will be really challenging. And I also wondered how that's my last words about this article 234 4 of the UNCLOS says sea ice covered area. That's the coastal country have this control or the regulation if there's no ice cover. So how we apply those articles, it would be very interesting in the 2030s or even longer run.
So I think it sounds like this is going to become increasingly an urgent global topic that we're going to see a lot more of. So it's good that we've begun to focus on this a little bit. And thank you so much,
Thank you, Catherine,
Yuanyuan, for
having me
helping us today to learn at least the ABCs of Arctic law and governance challenges. And we'll have to learn a great deal more in the years to come. Thank you very much. And
Thank you. Have a good day. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you to the audience for joining us. All right, bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.